Sometimes the truth doesn't return with a confession. Sometimes it walks into the room wearing your face. The church on Maple Street had not changed in 30 years. The white wooden walls still carried the faint scent of old varnish and lilies, and the stained glass windows painted the afternoon light in soft colors across the pews. Outside, the wind moved slowly through the tall oak trees that surrounded the small cemetery, rustling the leaves like whispers from another time. Inside the chapel, nearly everyone in the town had gathered for the funeral of Richard Caldwell, a man many called stubborn, proud, and quietly generous in ways few people ever fully understood. At the front of the room stood his only son, Ethan Caldwell, the man who had not lived in this town for nearly 15 years. At 38 years old, Ethan was known across the country as the founder and CEO of a technology company worth billions. His tailored black suit fit perfectly, his posture straight and controlled, his expression calm in the way powerful men often learn to be. The press sometimes described him as cold. Investors called him brilliant. But the people sitting in those wooden pews mostly remembered the boy who used to ride his bike down Maple Street after school. Ethan's eyes rested quietly on the polished oak casket at the front of the chapel. His father had lived 72 years in this town and had rarely left it, while Ethan had built an empire 3,000 miles away in Silicon Valley. The distance between them had grown slowly over the years, measured not in miles but in silence. The pastor's voice continued gently through the service, speaking about Richard Caldwell's life, about hard work and second chances, about a man who believed that family was the one thing no amount of money could replace. Ethan listened, but only half of the words reached him. The rest faded somewhere in the quiet echo of the chapel. When the service ended, the pastor invited everyone to stand for the final prayer. Chairs shifted softly across the wooden floor as people rose to their feet. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze moving across the crowd for the first time that afternoon. And that was when he saw her. She stood near the back row, almost hidden in the shadow of one of the tall windows. Naomi Brooks. 4. A moment the air seemed to leave Ethan's lungs. He had not seen her in nearly a decade. Her posture was calm, her expression composed, her dark coat simple but elegant against the pale light coming through the stained glass behind her. Time had changed her in quiet ways, but Ethan recognized her instantly. And she was not alone. Two boys stood beside her, each holding one of her hands. They looked to be about 8 or 9 years old, maybe 4 feet tall, dressed neatly in small black jackets and polished shoes. At first Ethan noticed only that they were twins. But then one of them lifted his head slightly, and the light from the window touched his face. Ethan felt something inside his chest tighten. The boy's eyes were the same shade of gray as his own. The shape of his jaw, the small curve of his smile, even the way he tilted his head while looking around the room. It was all painfully familiar. The second boy shifted beside him, and the resemblance became impossible to ignore. For several long seconds Ethan Caldwell forgot where he was. The quiet murmur of people leaving the pews faded into the background. All he could see were those two boys standing beside Naomi Brooks, both of them looking out into the chapel with faces that looked so much like his own childhood reflection that it felt less like coincidence and more like the past had suddenly walked back into his life. The quiet movement of people leaving the chapel slowly filled the room again, but Ethan Caldwell barely noticed it. His eyes remained fixed on the two boys standing beside Naomi Brooks, as if the world around them had faded into a distant blur. One of the boys shifted his weight slightly, adjusting the sleeve of his small black jacket the same way Ethan used to do when he was nervous during school assemblies. The gesture was so familiar that it felt like watching an old memory replay itself in real life. Ethan tried to convince himself that resemblance could be coincidence. Many children shared similar features. That was what logic told him. But logic did not explain the identical gray eyes, or the quiet confidence in the way the boys stood, or the unmistakable curve of the left eyebrow that Ethan had inherited from his father. The older women in the second row had noticed it too. Their whispers were soft, but in the quiet chapel every word seemed louder than it should have been. One of them leaned toward another and murmured that the boys looked just like Ethan when he was 8 years old, back when he used to run through this very church during Sunday gatherings while his father apologized politely to the pastor. Ethan swallowed slowly, his throat suddenly dry. Naomi had not looked at him yet. She stood with calm composure, her hand resting lightly on each boy's shoulder, as if protecting them from something invisible. The boys were studying the room with the curious patience that children often have in unfamiliar places. One of them glanced toward the front where Ethan stood and tilted his head slightly. The movement was subtle, but Ethan felt it like a quiet shock through his chest. He knew that gesture. He had seen it every morning in the mirror while shaving. The boy did not know who Ethan was. That much was clear in the innocent curiosity of his expression. To him, Ethan Caldwell was simply another adult in a room full of strangers dressed in black. Yet something in that moment felt deeply personal, as though time itself had placed a question directly in front of Ethan and was waiting for him to answer it. Naomi finally lifted her eyes. For the briefest second their gazes met across the chapel. Years of distance lived inside that single glance. Ethan saw recognition, caution, and something else that was harder to name. It was not anger. It was not regret. It was something steadier than either of those things, something that suggested Naomi had built a life that did not depend on whether Ethan Caldwell ever returned to this town or not. The pastor's assistant opened the chapel doors, and a cool breeze drifted inside from the cemetery outside. Sunlight stretched across the wooden floor in long golden lines. Naomi gently squeezed the shoulders of the boys and guided them toward the aisle. They began walking forward with the rest of the mourners who were preparing to follow the casket outside for the burial. As they moved closer, the resemblance became even more undeniable. Ethan could see the freckles across the bridge of one boy's nose, identical to the ones Ethan had tried to hide during his teenage years. The other boy carried himself with the same quiet posture Ethan had inherited from his father. It felt less like observing strangers and more like watching fragments of his own past walking toward him step by step. When the boys passed within a few feet of him, one of them looked up again. Their eyes met directly this time. The boy studied Ethan for a second with calm curiosity and then offered a small, polite smile, the kind of smile a well-raised child gives to an unfamiliar adult at a formal gathering. Ethan felt something shift inside his chest in a way he had not experienced in years. Naomi continued walking without stopping, guiding the boys toward the open doors where the afternoon light waited outside. She did not say a single word to Ethan. She did not slow her pace. She simply walked past him as though the years between them were a closed chapter that no longer needed explanation. But as Ethan watched the three of them step out into the sunlight, a single thought settled heavily in his mind, one that refused to leave no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it. Those boys did not just resemble him. They looked like a future he had never known existed. The slow procession moved from the chapel toward the cemetery behind the church, where rows of old headstones rested beneath tall oak trees that had watched generations of families come and go. Ethan Caldwell followed several steps behind the casket, but his attention was no longer on the quiet ceremony unfolding around him. His eyes kept searching the small crowd ahead until he found them again. Naomi Brooks walked near the back of the group with the two boys beside her, their small polished shoes pressing gently into the gravel path that led toward the burial site. The boys stayed close to her, occasionally glancing around with the calm curiosity of children who had been taught to behave with quiet respect during serious moments. Every time one of them turned his head, Ethan felt the same unsettling recognition settle deeper into his mind. It was not just the color of their eyes or the shape of their faces. It was something more subtle, something that came from the way they moved and observed the world. Ethan had seen those small details before in his own childhood. Photographs, the ones his father used to keep on the living room shelf beside an old brass clock. The memory of that house appeared suddenly in Ethan's mind, as clear as if he had stepped backward in time. 10 years earlier, before his company had become famous, before the interviews in business magazines and billion-dollar valuations, Ethan had still been a young man trying to leave this town behind. Back then Maple Street had felt too small for the life he imagined building. Naomi Brooks had been part of that life, though neither of them had fully realized how important those quiet days would become later. She used to meet him outside the small coffee shop across from the gas station every Saturday morning. They would sit near the window with 2 paper cups of coffee, watching pickup trucks pass slowly along the road while Naomi talked about the future she wanted to build as a teacher in the local school district. Ethan would listen while sketching business ideas on napkins, convinced that the world outside this town was waiting for him. Naomi believed in him during those early days in a way that very few people ever did. She used to tell him that ambition was not something to be ashamed of, as long as he remembered where he came from. But the last conversation they had shared had not been peaceful like those mornings in the coffee shop. Ethan could still remember the sharp tension in the air that evening nearly a decade ago. He had been preparing to leave for California after receiving the opportunity that would eventually change his entire life. Rumors had reached him through careless conversations around town, suggestions that Naomi might have been seeing someone else while he was away on business trips. Instead of asking calmly, Ethan had allowed pride and frustration to guide his reaction. The argument had been brief but painful. Naomi had tried to explain something that Ethan had refused to hear, and by the time the sun disappeared behind the houses along Maple Street, he had already convinced himself that leaving town meant leaving her behind as well. Within 2 weeks, Ethan Caldwell was on a plane heading west, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the belief that the past could be erased simply by moving far enough away from it. Standing now in the quiet cemetery, watching Naomi and the 2 boys beside her, Ethan felt a slow realization forming inside his chest. For the first time in many years, he began to wonder whether that final argument had ended a story he never truly understood. The small crowd gathered quietly around the open grave while the afternoon sun drifted slowly behind a thin layer of clouds, softening the light that touched the cemetery. The pastor spoke gently about Richard Caldwell's life, about the years he spent repairing engines in the old garage on Pine Road, and the quiet way he helped neighbors whenever someone's car broke down late at night. Ethan stood near the front beside the casket, his hands folded in front of him, listening to words that felt both familiar and distant at the same time. For most of his adult life, he had measured time in board meetings, investor calls, and international flights. Standing here now, with the scent of freshly turned soil in the air and the quiet rustling of oak leaves overhead, he realized how little he had understood about the years his father lived without him nearby. A few steps behind the gathering, Naomi Brooks stood with the 2 boys beside her. They had remained silent through the entire ceremony, their small shoulders straight as they listened with careful attention. One of the boys reached down to pick up a small acorn from the ground, rolling it slowly between his fingers while watching the adults speak. The other boy glanced occasionally toward Ethan with the same thoughtful expression that had unsettled him inside the chapel. Ethan tried to keep his attention on the ceremony, but every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward them. The resemblance felt impossible to ignore now that the 3 of them stood only 20 feet away. The same gray eyes, the same narrow chin. Even the way one boy leaned slightly to the left while standing reminded Ethan of the way he used to balance his weight when he grew tired during long school assemblies. The quiet voice of the pastor eventually faded as the final prayer ended. People stepped forward one by one to place white roses beside the casket before returning to the gravel path. Ethan accepted a rose from the church volunteer and stepped forward slowly. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking down at the polished wood that reflected the pale afternoon light. Memories came quietly, not as dramatic moments, but as small, ordinary scenes. His father sitting on the porch during summer evenings. The sound of tools clinking in the garage. The smell of motor oil and coffee that seemed to follow Richard Caldwell everywhere he went. Ethan placed the rose gently beside the others and stepped back. As he turned, his eyes instinctively searched the crowd again. Naomi was now walking toward the grave with the boys beside her. The movement was calm and respectful, but there was something steady about the way she carried herself that caught Ethan's attention. She had not looked at him again since leaving the chapel. When she reached the front, the boys waited quietly while she placed a single white flower beside the casket. One of the boys studied the wooden nameplate for a moment before softly asking something that Ethan could not hear from where he stood. Naomi leaned down and answered him quietly. Whatever she said made the boy nod slowly with understanding. Then both boys straightened again and stepped back beside her. As they turned to leave, the shorter of the twins glanced up once more and met Ethan's gaze across the small distance between them. The boy held the look for a second longer this time, as if trying to recognize something familiar that he could not quite explain. Ethan felt the same strange pull inside his chest again. It was the kind of quiet recognition that did not come from logic, but from something deeper. Naomi gently placed her hand on the boy's shoulder and guided him toward the gravel path. As they walked away, Ethan noticed something else that made his breath slow almost to a stop. The older twin had tucked his hands into the pockets of his jacket exactly the way Ethan always did without thinking, a small habit his father used to tease him about when he was young. Watching the three figures move slowly toward the edge of the cemetery, Ethan realized that the question forming in his mind was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence. It was beginning to feel like the past had returned with an answer that someone had kept hidden for many years. The quiet crowd slowly began to disperse after the burial, people speaking in soft voices as they made their way down the narrow gravel path that curved toward the church parking lot. The afternoon air carried the gentle scent of grass and distant rain, and for the first time since arriving in town, Ethan Caldwell found himself standing alone beside the grave that had just been filled. The workers had already stepped away, leaving the fresh soil neatly shaped beneath the simple headstone that now carried his father's name. Ethan remained there for a few seconds longer, his hands resting in the pockets of his coat, while the reality of the day settled slowly into his thoughts. Across the cemetery, he could still see Naomi Brooks walking with the two boys toward the wooden gate near the road. They moved together in quiet harmony, the way families often do, without even realizing it. One of the boys was talking softly while the other listened with the patient attention of an older brother, though it was impossible to tell which of them had been born first. Naomi occasionally nodded as they spoke, guiding them along the path with a calm steadiness that suggested this was not the first difficult day she had navigated with them. Ethan watched them longer than he intended. Something inside him resisted the idea of simply walking away. The question that had begun forming earlier in the chapel had now grown too large to ignore. Before he could reconsider, Ethan stepped away from the grave and followed the same gravel path toward the gate. The distance between them closed slowly. The sound of small stones shifting under his shoes caused Naomi to glance back over her shoulder. She stopped walking when she recognized him approaching. The boys noticed her pause and turned around as well, their curious eyes studying the tall stranger who had stood near the front of the ceremony. For a moment, none of them spoke. The quiet hum of insects in the grass and the distant sound of a passing pickup truck filled the space between them. Ethan stopped a few feet away, suddenly aware that the confident voice he used in boardrooms across the country felt strangely unfamiliar here. Naomi looked exactly the same as she had earlier in the chapel, composed and calm, though her eyes carried the weight of years that Ethan had never witnessed. The boys stood close beside her, their small shoulders nearly touching as they observed him with open curiosity. Up close, the resemblance was even clearer. Ethan felt it again, that strange recognition that did not belong to logic or coincidence. One of the boys shifted his weight slightly and glanced up at Naomi before looking back at Ethan again. His expression held the simple honesty that children often show when trying to understand an unfamiliar situation. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter than he expected. He asked Naomi how long she had been back in town. The question sounded ordinary, but both of them understood that it carried much deeper meaning beneath it. Naomi answered calmly that she had never left. She explained that she worked at the elementary school just 2 miles down the road, teaching fourth-grade students who still believed every problem could be solved with patience and kindness. Her voice remained steady as she spoke, but she did not offer any additional explanation about the boys beside her. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the words while his eyes drifted once more toward the two children. The shorter twin studied him carefully before speaking with polite curiosity. He asked Naomi in a soft voice whether this man had known their grandfather. The word grandfather landed in Ethan's mind like a quiet echo that refused to fade. Naomi hesitated for the briefest moment before answering that yes. The man standing in front of them had known Richard Caldwell very well. The boy accepted the explanation with a thoughtful nod, though he continued looking at Ethan as if trying to place a familiar detail that remained just beyond his understanding. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle deeper into his chest. The question that had been building since the chapel finally reached the edge of his voice. He looked directly at Naomi and asked the one thing that could no longer remain unspoken. He asked her how old the boys were. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. She answered that they were 9 years old, and the quiet certainty in her voice made the afternoon air feel suddenly much heavier than before. The number lingered in the quiet air between them. 9 years. Ethan Caldwell felt the calculation happen automatically in his mind, the way numbers always arranged themselves when he studied financial projections or corporate reports. 9 years ago, he had left this town with a single suitcase and a restless determination to build something bigger than Maple Street had ever offered him. 9 years ago had also been the last time he had spoken to Naomi Brooks before that final argument outside the coffee shop. The timing aligned too perfectly to dismiss. Ethan did not immediately respond. His eyes moved slowly from Naomi to the two boys standing beside her. Now that he knew their age, the resemblance carried even more weight. The taller twin shifted slightly and pushed his hands into the pockets of his small jacket, copying the same casual posture Ethan had used earlier at the graveside. The smaller twin studied Ethan with the open curiosity of a child who sensed that something important was happening even if he did not fully understand it yet. Ethan inhaled slowly, steadying his voice. He asked Naomi what their names were. Naomi rested a gentle hand on each boy's shoulder before answering. She said the boy on her left was Noah Brooks, and the one beside him was Nathan Brooks. The boys nodded politely when Ethan repeated their names, their expressions calm but attentive. Ethan noticed the way Noah spoke first when introducing himself, as though he had naturally taken on the quiet responsibility of being the slightly more confident twin. Nathan stood half a step closer to Naomi, his eyes thoughtful and observant as he watched every detail of the conversation unfolding between the adults. Ethan forced a small polite smile and told them his name. Both boys nodded again with the same careful manners that suggested Naomi had raised them with patience and discipline. Nathan tilted his head slightly before asking if Ethan had lived in town when their grandfather was younger. The question caught Ethan by surprise. He answered honestly that he had grown up here many years ago before moving away for work. Noah glanced briefly toward Naomi before looking back at Ethan with a spark of interest. He asked if Ethan worked in one of the big office buildings in California that he had seen in pictures on television. Ethan nodded slowly and explained that his company built technology that helped people communicate across long distances. The explanation felt strangely simple compared to the complicated presentations he normally delivered to investors. Yet the boys listened with genuine fascination, as if the idea of building something important was exciting in a way that had nothing to do with money. Naomi remained quiet while the brief conversation unfolded. Her expression stayed composed, though Ethan could sense the careful attention in the way she watched both him and the boys at the same time. Finally, Ethan looked back at her, the question that had been pressing against his thoughts growing heavier with each passing second. He asked softly how long the boys had known Richard Caldwell. Naomi's answer came without hesitation. She explained that Richard had been part of their lives for several years, that he often visited after school, and sometimes helped the boys fix small things around the house when something broke. Ethan felt a sudden stillness spread through his chest. His father had known them, not as distant acquaintances, not as neighbors, but as part of their everyday lives. Ethan looked again at Noah and Nathan, realizing that while he had been building a global company 3,000 miles away, the man buried behind him had quietly been spending time with two boys who carried the same unmistakable features Ethan saw every morning in the mirror. The quiet road beside the cemetery stretched toward the edge of town, where a row of maple trees cast long afternoon shadows across the pavement. Naomi Brooks stood calmly beside Noah and Nathan while the warm breeze moved softly through the grass nearby. Ethan Caldwell remained where he was for a moment longer, absorbing the words she had just spoken about his father. The realization settled slowly but heavily in his mind. Richard Caldwell had not simply known these boys. He had been part of their routine, their afternoons, their small, everyday moments. While Ethan had been presenting billion-dollar strategies in glass conference rooms 3,000 miles away, his father had apparently been helping two 9-year-old boys tighten loose screws on kitchen chairs and repair broken bicycle chains. Ethan looked at Noah and Nathan again, noticing the quiet patience in the way they waited for the adults to finish speaking. Children raised with care often carried that calm attentiveness. Noah glanced toward the cemetery gate before turning back to Ethan with thoughtful curiosity. He asked if Ethan had ever met their grandfather before today. Ethan felt the question settle gently but firmly against his thoughts. He nodded slowly and explained that Richard Caldwell had been his father. The words left his mouth in a calm tone, but the reaction from the boys was immediate and sincere. Both twins looked surprised in the natural way children react when two pieces of information suddenly connect in their minds. Nathan's eyebrows lifted slightly as he looked from Ethan to Naomi and then back again. Noah studied Ethan more closely now, as if examining a puzzle that had just begun to make sense. Naomi watched the moment unfold without interrupting, though Ethan could see the quiet tension behind her composed expression. She had clearly expected this conversation to arrive eventually, but the timing had still caught everyone off guard. Nathan spoke first. He said that their grandfather used to talk about a son who lived far away and built computers and machines that helped people talk across the country. Ethan felt a strange warmth rise in his chest hearing the description. His father had spoken about him to the boys. Even after years of distance and silence, Richard Caldwell had not erased him from his life. Noah added that sometimes their grandfather would point toward the highway outside town and say that if they followed that road long enough they would eventually reach the place where Ethan worked. The boy said it with simple admiration, the kind children feel when imagining a world much larger than their own small town. Ethan glanced briefly at Naomi. Her expression remained steady, but there was a quiet honesty in her eyes that suggested she had never tried to hide the truth about who Ethan was. She had simply allowed the boys to grow up with the information they needed, nothing more and nothing less. Ethan slowly exhaled, realizing that the man buried behind him had been carrying a secret for many years. Richard Caldwell had watched Ethan leave town with anger and misunderstanding still hanging in the air, yet he had quietly stepped into a role that Ethan himself had never known existed. The thought lingered heavily in Ethan's mind as he looked once more at the two boys standing in front of him. For the first time since seeing them in the chapel, the resemblance no longer felt like a coincidence that could be ignored. It felt like a truth waiting patiently for someone to finally acknowledge it. The afternoon sun had begun to lower behind the maple trees when the quiet conversation near the cemetery gate slowly came to a pause. A few remaining cars pulled away from the church parking lot, their engines fading into the distance until the road was nearly silent again. Ethan Caldwell stood facing Naomi Brooks and the two boys, feeling the weight of everything he had just learned settling deeper into his thoughts. The idea that his father had spent years quietly visiting these children felt almost impossible to fully absorb. Yet the calm certainty in Naomi's voice left little room for doubt. Richard Caldwell had known them. He had chosen to be present in their lives while Ethan had been building a future far away from this small town. Nathan shifted slightly beside Naomi and looked up at Ethan again with the same thoughtful curiosity that had followed him since the chapel. Children had a way of sensing when adults were carrying important questions, even if those questions had not yet been spoken aloud. Noah gently nudged his brother and whispered something that made Nathan smile before both boys turned their attention back to Ethan. The moment felt strangely natural, as though the four of them had been standing together like this many times before instead of meeting for the first time beside a cemetery gate. Ethan finally looked at Naomi again. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet seriousness behind it now. He asked her why his father had never told him about the boys. Naomi did not answer immediately. She glanced briefly toward the cemetery behind Ethan, where the fresh soil marked the place where Richard Caldwell now rested. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm honesty that had always been part of her character. She explained that Richard had believed some truths needed the right moment to be heard. According to Naomi, he had once said that Ethan had left town carrying anger and misunderstanding, and that forcing the truth on him at the wrong time might only make things worse. Instead, Richard had chosen patience. He had visited the boys quietly after school, sometimes bringing small tools to help them fix a loose bike pedal or a broken drawer handle in Naomi's kitchen. He had told them stories about a young man who used to run through Maple Street dreaming about building something big enough to reach the entire country. Ethan listened without interrupting, feeling the familiar image of his father shift slightly in his mind. Richard Caldwell had always been a man of simple routines, but it was becoming clear that those routines had hidden a deeper purpose during the years Ethan had been gone. Noah spoke up again, his voice filled with the straightforward honesty children rarely hide. He said their grandfather used to tell them that someday they might meet the man who had built machines that connected people across long distances. Noah admitted that he had imagined Ethan working inside a tall building filled with blinking screens and complicated equipment. Nathan nodded enthusiastically beside him, clearly sharing the same picture in his imagination. Ethan allowed himself a small smile at the description. The image was not entirely inaccurate. Yet hearing it from the boys made his accomplishments feel less like headlines and more like something personal that his father had quietly been proud of. Naomi watched Ethan carefully before adding one more thing. She said that Richard had believed the boys deserved the chance to know their father someday, but he also believed that moment had to happen naturally, not through pressure or guilt. Ethan felt those words settle heavily in his chest. He looked again at Noah and Nathan, noticing how easily they stood together, how their presence seemed both new and strangely familiar at the same time. For the first time since arriving in town that morning, Ethan realized that the story he thought he had left behind 9 years earlier had never truly ended. It had simply been waiting for him to return and finally understand it. The last of the afternoon light stretched across the quiet road beside the cemetery as the conversation slowly settled into a thoughtful silence. A distant breeze moved gently through the maple leaves above them, carrying the soft sound of rustling branches that seemed almost like a quiet reminder that time never truly stopped moving forward. Ethan Caldwell stood facing Naomi Brooks and the two boys, feeling a mixture of emotions that no business negotiation or boardroom decision had ever prepared him to handle. For years he had believed success was measured by numbers, by the scale of companies built and the distance traveled from the small town where he grew up. Yet standing here now, only a few feet from two boys who carried his eyes and his father's quiet patience, Ethan felt a different kind of measure forming in his mind. Noah shifted his weight and glanced up at Ethan again with thoughtful curiosity. He asked if Ethan would be staying in town for a while after the funeral. The question was simple, but it carried the innocent openness that children offered without realizing how much meaning it held for the adults around them. Ethan paused before answering. In his normal life, every hour of his schedule was carefully planned weeks in advance, flights booked between cities, meetings scheduled across multiple time zones. Yet in this moment, those distant commitments felt strangely less important than the small gravel road beneath his feet and the two boys waiting quietly for his response. Ethan said that he would be staying for a few days to take care of his father's house and the paperwork that followed any funeral. Nathan nodded slowly, clearly satisfied with the explanation, though his curious eyes continued studying Ethan as if he were trying to understand how this unfamiliar man fit into the stories their grandfather had once told. Naomi watched the exchange calmly, her expression steady but thoughtful. She had always been someone who listened carefully before speaking, and that quiet strength remained unchanged even after all the years that had passed. Ethan finally looked at her again, aware that the moment he had avoided for nearly a decade could no longer be postponed. His voice remained calm, but there was a deeper sincerity behind it now. He told Naomi that he wished he had listened more carefully the night they argued years ago, before he left town believing something that might not have been true. Naomi met his gaze with the same composed honesty she had shown all afternoon. She explained softly that life had continued moving forward for both of them, whether they understood each other back then or not. She said that raising Noah and Nathan had filled her days with responsibility, patience, and purpose, and that she had never expected anything from Ethan after he left. The boys listened quietly beside her, sensing that the conversation carried emotions they were still too young to fully understand. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting the weight of those words. He looked again at Noah and Nathan, noticing how naturally they stood beside Naomi, how their presence carried both the past he had left behind and the future he had never imagined. The realization settled gently but firmly inside him. For 9 years he had believed that leaving Maple Street meant closing the door on everything he had once been. Yet now it was clear that some parts of life did not disappear simply because someone walked away from them. Noah suddenly stepped a little closer, his voice soft but confident in the straightforward way children often speak. He asked Ethan if he would ever like to see the small tree house their grandfather had helped them build behind Naomi's house last summer. The invitation was simple, offered without expectation or pressure, just a child sharing something important from his world. Ethan felt a quiet warmth rise in his chest at the question. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a genuine smile. He told Noah that he would like that very much. As the sun continued lowering toward the horizon and the shadows grew longer along the quiet road, Ethan Caldwell realized that the future he had spent years building might now include something far more meaningful than the success he had always chased. It might include learning how to be present in the lives of two boys who had unknowingly been carrying a piece of his story all along.